You wake up every morning with a strange feeling in your stomach, an uneasiness you cannot name. Perhaps you attribute it to work, traffic, bills to pay, or the disturbing news reaching you through your phone screen. You check your social media and feel a confusing mixture of relief and anxiety, seeing other people living lives that seem more organized, more meaningful, more coherent than your own. You go to work and perform tasks that you often feel could be automated, while wondering what your real purpose is in this world that changes so rapidly you can barely keep up. You come home and watch news that seems to come from completely different parallel realities, depending on which source you choose, and wonder how people looking at the same events can reach such radically opposite conclusions about what is happening. But what if I told you that this feeling is not just yours, not just personal, and not just about the superficial difficulties you can identify? What if this uneasiness is actually your body and mind detecting something much deeper and more disturbing? That the very fabric of reality as we know it is unraveling before our eyes, and that most of us cannot see this because we are focused only on the symptoms, not the fundamental causes. Imagine a person walking through a house that seems normal at first glance. The lights work, water runs from the faucets, the furniture is in its usual place, but this person is so focused on small details that they cannot see the bigger picture. The wallpaper is peeling because the walls are moving. The doors do not close properly because the foundation is giving way. The furniture seems out of place because the floor is no longer level. The support beams of the house are silently rotting, and the entire structure is heading toward inevitable collapse. This person might even notice that something is wrong. They might complain about the wallpaper, try to fix doors that won't close, rearrange the furniture. But because they are focused on symptoms rather than fundamental causes, all their efforts are futile. The house will collapse no matter how many times they paint the walls or change the locks. This is exactly the historical moment we are living in. We are so focused on the superficial problems of our era that we cannot see that the fundamental structures of human civilization are undergoing a transformation so radical that it amounts to simultaneous collapse and reconstruction. We complain about politics, about economics, about technology, about social changes, as if these were isolated problems that could be solved through gradual reforms or leadership changes. But these are merely symptoms of something much deeper, a fundamental change in the very nature of human reality that is happening at a speed and scale unprecedented in the history of our species. And today, we will explore together not only what is collapsing, but why our own human nature prevents us from seeing the full extent of this radical transformation, and what we can do to navigate consciously through this civilizational metamorphosis instead of being simply its passive victims. To truly understand what is happening to us at this historical moment, we first need to understand that every human civilization is built upon layers of shared fictions. These fictions are not malicious lies, but rather collective narratives that allow us to cooperate en masse and create social order. They are the invisible software running on the hardware of human biology, allowing creatures that evolved to live in small kinship groups, to cooperate in societies of millions or billions of individuals who have never met personally. For millennia, we developed stories about gods, nations, currencies, human rights, romantic love, and life purpose that functioned as invisible cement holding our societies together. The ancient Egyptians believed that the pharaoh was a living god, an incarnation of Horus on earth, and this fiction allowed thousands of people to coordinate efforts for decades to build pyramids that defied the known laws of physics at the time. Workers carried 2-ton stone blocks for kilometers. Architects calculated angles with extraordinary mathematical precision, and an entire society organized its economy around this colossal project, all because they shared a story about the divine nature of political power that gave transcendent meaning to the hardest labor. Medieval Europeans organized their entire lives around the promise of eternal life in paradise, a fiction that gave meaning to existences that were often brutal and short. Peasants worked from dawn to dusk in conditions of extreme poverty, but found purpose in this suffering because they believed it was part of a divine plan that would reward them in eternity. Crusaders marched thousands of kilometers to die in distant lands because they believed this death had cosmic meaning. Monks dedicated entire lives to prayer and contemplation because they believed these activities contributed to salvation not only of their own souls, but of all humanity. In the modern era, we developed secular fictions equally powerful. The fiction of the nation allowed millions of people to identify as French, German, or American, creating solidarity with strangers who shared the same language and territory. The fiction of money allowed complex economic systems to function based on mutual trust that small pieces of paper or digits on a screen represented real value. The fiction of universal human rights created the moral basis for liberation movements that transformed the world, even though these rights exist nowhere in nature and are purely human constructions. What we are witnessing today is not simply another political or technological change, but rather the simultaneous collapse of multiple fundamental fictions that structured human experience for centuries, and this is happening at unprecedented speed in human history. It is as if all the narratives that allowed us to make sense of the world were being rewritten simultaneously, leaving us temporarily without the conceptual maps necessary to navigate reality. The first great fiction that is collapsing is that of the autonomous and rational individual. For hundreds of years, especially since the Enlightenment, we have built our institutions, our economy, and our understanding of ourselves based on the idea that each person is a separate entity capable of making rational decisions based on objective information. This was a revolutionary fiction that freed us from rigid social structures and enabled the development of liberal democracy, free market capitalism, and the very notion of individual human rights. The idea that each person possesses free will and rational choice capacity justified legal systems based on personal responsibility, markets based on competition between independent agents, and political philosophies based on individual consent. But in recent decades, a confluence of scientific discoveries has irrefutably revealed that this self-conception is fundamentally illusory. Neuroscience has demonstrated that our brain is not a rational processing machine, but rather a chaotic collection of ancient evolutionary systems that were developed to help us survive in small hunter-gatherer groups tens of thousands of years ago. Our limbic system, responsible for emotions and impulses, is millions of years older than our prefrontal cortex, responsible for abstract thinking and long-term planning. This neural architecture means that our decisions are fundamentally determined by unconscious emotional systems that process information much faster than our rational consciousness. Studies in behavioral psychology have revealed that we are systematically irrational in predictable ways. We suffer from dozens of cognitive biases that distort our perception of reality. Confirmation bias makes us seek information that confirms our existing beliefs while ignoring contrary evidence. Availability bias makes us overestimate the probability of events we can easily remember. Anchoring bias causes us to be excessively influenced by the first information we receive about any topic. Negativity bias makes us pay much more attention to potential threats than to opportunities. And social conformity bias makes us change our opinions to align with social groups even when we know the group is wrong. Even more disturbing, experiments in neuroscience have shown that our very notion of having a coherent and continuous self is a neurological illusion. What we experience as unified consciousness is actually the result of multiple brain systems operating in parallel, with our rational mind creating post hoc narratives to give the impression of coherence and conscious control over decisions that have already been made by unconscious systems. Famous experiments by Benjamin Libet demonstrated that neural activity associated with a decision can be detected up to half a second before the person reports being aware of having made the decision. Our sense of free will appears to be mainly a story we tell ourselves about decisions that were already determined by processes of which we have no conscious knowledge. Meanwhile, the development of artificial intelligence has revealed that algorithms can already predict our behavior better than we can ourselves. YouTube recommendation systems can predict what type of video you will want to watch with more accuracy than you can anticipate your own preferences. Marketing algorithms can determine your mood and purchasing intentions based simply on the speed with which you scroll through content on social media. Fraud detection systems can identify suspicious behavior in financial transactions with superhuman accuracy. These algorithms work because our behavior is much more predictable and determined by unconscious patterns than our subjective experience of free choice suggests. Technology corporations use this knowledge about our fundamental irrationality to influence us in ways we do not even perceive. Persuasive app design exploits our evolutionary need for social validation through likes and comments, creating dopamine loops that keep us engaged even when we consciously recognize that excessive social media use is harming our well-being. Recommendation algorithms learn to keep us on the platform by offering progressively more extreme and emotional content, because content that provokes outrage and anxiety generates more engagement than balanced and nuanced content. Digital advertising has become a form of microscopic psychological manipulation. Ads can be targeted not only based on our past purchases and demographic data, but on our emotional state inferred from our online activity, our real-time geographic location, and even subtle patterns in how we move the mouse or touch the screen. Algorithms can identify when we are emotionally vulnerable and show us products that promise relief for anxieties we did not even realize we had. Dynamic pricing techniques can adjust prices in real time based on our inferred probability of making a purchase, maximizing how much we will pay for any item. The fiction of the rational and autonomous individual is revealing itself to be exactly that, a useful fiction that allowed us to build certain forms of social organization, but which does not correspond to the reality of how our minds actually work. And when a fiction so central to our social organization begins to crumble, the entire structure of society trembles. Our economy is based on the idea that consumers make rational choices based on personal preferences, but we discover that preferences can be manipulated through subtle psychological techniques. Our democracy is based on the idea that citizens can objectively evaluate candidates and policies, but we discover that political opinions are formed primarily through tribal identity and unconscious emotions. Our legal system is based on the idea of personal responsibility and free will, but we discover that behavior is largely determined by factors beyond individual conscious control. This is not just an intellectual crisis, but an existential crisis. If we are not really the rational and autonomous agents we thought we were, then who are we? If our choices are determined by ancient evolutionary algorithms and external manipulation, then what is the meaning of individual life? If our experience of having a coherent self is an illusion, then what justifies our moral and political systems based on individual rights and responsibilities? Simultaneously, the fiction of objective truth and reliable knowledge is collapsing. During the modern era, we developed institutions specialized in creating and verifying knowledge. Universities with rigorous systems of research and peer review, newspapers with editorial standards and fact-checking, libraries that preserved accumulated knowledge, museums that curated artifacts and historical interpretations, and scientific communities that developed sophisticated methodologies to distinguish between truth and error. These institutions were not perfect. They were influenced by cultural prejudices, economic interests, and power dynamics, but they provided a shared reference point that allowed societies to make collective decisions based on some kind of consensus about basic facts of reality. This system worked because it created information bottlenecks that forced verification processes. For an idea to reach mass audience, it first had to pass the scrutiny of editors, reviewers, librarians, and other knowledge gatekeepers who had professional reputation at stake. The high cost of publishing and distributing information meant that only ideas that passed through multiple layers of verification could reach large audiences. People with specialized training controlled mass communication channels, and their credibility depended on maintaining standards of factual accuracy. The digital revolution destroyed this system irrevocably and irreversibly. Today, anyone with a phone can publish information that reaches millions of people instantly without any verification process or accountability. The marginal cost of creating and distributing information has approached zero, eliminating the natural bottlenecks that once forced verification. Anyone can create a website that looks like a legitimate media outlet, can buy domains that mimic respectable organizations, can use editing tools to create convincing visual evidence of events that never happened. More fundamentally, social media algorithms amplify information not because it is true, but because it generates emotional engagement. Content that provokes outrage, fear, excitement, or tribal solidarity receives far more shares, clicks, and attention time than factual and balanced content. The algorithms have learned that our evolutionary psychology responds much more strongly to information that activates our threat detection systems or our needs for social belonging than to information that requires complex, rational processing. As a result, the platforms that determine what information most people see are specifically optimized to promote content that is psychologically addictive rather than factually accurate. Deepfakes and generative artificial intelligence have created an even deeper epistemological crisis by making it impossible to distinguish between genuine and fabricated content. Today, anyone with a laptop can create convincing videos of public figures saying things they never said, can generate photorealistic photographs of events that never happened, can produce complete academic articles about research that was never conducted. The very notion of visual or documentary evidence as basis for fact verification is becoming obsolete. Even more worrying, different groups of people now live in completely separate informational realities, each with their own facts, experts, and narratives about how the world works. We are not simply disagreeing about interpretations of the same events. We are disagreeing about which events actually happened. Some groups believe climate change is an existential threat based on overwhelming scientific consensus. Other groups believe climate change is an elaborate conspiracy to expand government control. Some groups believe vaccines are one of the greatest achievements of modern medicine. Other groups believe vaccines are a form of population control or non-consensual medical experimentation. Some groups believe certain elections were free and fair. Other groups believe they were systematically fraudulent. This is not simply a matter of political polarization, but rather the collapse of any shared epistemological foundation for collective decision-making. When a society loses the ability to agree on basic facts, it loses the ability to function as a coherent society. We cannot solve collective problems if we cannot even agree on which problems actually exist. We cannot make rational political decisions if different groups are operating with completely different sets of assumptions about reality. The phenomenon of digital echo chambers intensifies this fragmentation. Personalization algorithms ensure that each person sees mainly content that confirms their existing beliefs. If you believe in a particular conspiracy theory, the algorithm learns this and begins showing progressively more related content, creating the impression that this worldview is more common and well-founded than it really is. If you have particular political leanings, you will be directed to online communities where these leanings are intensified and radicalized through constant exposure to increasingly extreme versions of the same ideas. The result is that we have lost not only a single source of truth, but any shared methodology for determining truth. Science, journalism, formal education, and other traditional knowledge-creating institutions are viewed by a growing proportion of the population as just another source of opinion with particular biases, not as special methods for distinguishing between truth and error. The very idea of expertise is viewed with suspicion because anyone can find online someone with impressive credentials who confirms whatever belief they want to have validated. This epistemological crisis creates political and social paralysis. If we cannot agree on basic facts, how can we agree on solutions? If every information source is seen as potentially compromised, how can we make evidence-based collective decisions? If each group has its own experts and its own interpretation of data, how can we distinguish between policies based on solid knowledge and policies based on wishful thinking or particular interests? The third fundamental fiction that is disintegrating is that of transcendent meaning and purpose. Throughout most of human history, people found meaning for their lives through grand religious or ideological narratives that connected their daily actions to greater cosmic purposes. Working the land was not just agriculture. It was participating in the divine cycle of creation, collaborating with God in maintaining cosmic order. Fighting for your nation was not just organized violence. It was defending sacred values, protecting ancestral tradition, ensuring that future generations could live according to transcendent principles. Having children was not just biological reproduction. It was contributing to a divine plan, ensuring the continuity of a sacred lineage, or participating in the progressive improvement of the human condition. These religious narratives worked because they connected each individual action, no matter how mundane, to a cosmic story about the ultimate meaning and destiny of existence. A medieval peasant burning fields before planting was not just following agricultural techniques. They were participating in rituals that connected their economic activity to divine cycles of death and rebirth. A mother teaching moral values to her children was not just socializing the next generation, she was transmitting sacred wisdom that had been revealed by God and that would ensure the eternal salvation of her family. A soldier dying in battle was not simply losing his life. He was ensuring his place in paradise and defending the moral order of the universe against forces of evil. Modern secularism attempted to replace these religious narratives with other equally grand ones. Scientific progress that would eventually reveal all the mysteries of the universe and solve all human problems. Social justice that would eventually create a perfectly egalitarian society where all unnecessary suffering would be eliminated. Economic development that would eventually bring material prosperity to all humanity. And personal fulfillment through discovery and expression of unique individual personality. Each of these narratives promised that individual actions contributed to progressive improvements in the human condition that would eventually result in some form of terrestrial utopia. But these secular narratives are proving to be much more fragile than their religious predecessors. As we become more aware of the fundamental limitations of science, we begin to perceive that the idea that scientific research would eventually answer all important questions about existence was naive. We discovered that each scientific answer generates new questions, even more complex, that there are fundamental limits to what can be known through empirical methods, and that questions about meaning, purpose, and value cannot be answered through scientific investigation because they are normative questions, not factual ones. The pursuit of social justice has revealed inherent contradictions that seem unsolvable. We discovered that different groups have incompatible definitions of justice, that efforts to eliminate some forms of inequality often create new forms of inequality, that systems designed to maximize equality often reduce individual freedom, and that improvements in material living conditions do not automatically result in greater happiness or satisfaction. The very notion of linear moral progress is being questioned as we realize that apparently more advanced societies often face problems that simpler societies manage to avoid. The model of infinite economic development on a finite planet is revealing environmental costs that may be literally catastrophic for human civilization. Climate change, biodiversity loss, ocean pollution, and depletion of natural resources are forcing recognition that continuous economic growth may be incompatible with long-term survival of our species. The promise that technology would eventually solve all these problems is being questioned as we realize that many technological innovations create new problems as quickly as they solve old ones. The search for personal fulfillment through individual expression and career development is also revealing fundamental limitations. In an economy where most jobs can eventually be automated, the idea of finding purpose through professional career seems increasingly illusory. In a culture where individual identity is constantly performed and validated through social media, the search for authenticity becomes a form of theater where even private moments are staged for public consumption. In a society where there are infinite possibilities for experience and expression, the paradox of choice creates paralyzing anxiety instead of empowering liberation. Simultaneously, the speed of technological change has made it impossible to build stable identities based on career, community, or even lasting relationships. Professions that existed for centuries are disappearing in decades. Geographic communities are being dispersed by economic and social mobility. Romantic relationships are mediated by applications that gamify love and create unrealistic expectations about perfect compatibility. Families are geographically separated and communicate mainly through technology. The social structures that traditionally provided identity stability are all in constant flux. The result is a generalized existential crisis that manifests as epidemics of anxiety, depression, addiction, and a desperate search for meaning through compulsive consumption, constant entertainment, or adherence to extreme ideologies that promise certainty in a world of fundamental uncertainty. Young people report unprecedented levels of anxiety about the future, not only because they face economic challenges, but because they cannot imagine what kind of life is worth living when all traditional categories of meaning seem inadequate or suspect. This meaning crisis is exacerbated by the global and accelerated nature of contemporary communication. Previously, people compared their lives mainly with members of their local communities and previous family generations. Today, we are constantly exposed to curated representations of the lives of millions of people around the world, creating impossible comparisons and unrealistic expectations about what constitutes a well-lived life. Social media amplifies the sense of personal inadequacy by showing us highlight reel versions of other people's lives while we experience our own existence with all its mundane moments and internal difficulties. The democratization of information about other cultures and life possibilities has also created a form of existential paralysis. When we know there are thousands of different ways to organize society, to define success, to structure relationships, to find purpose, it becomes impossible to automatically accept the specific forms that our particular culture offers. Cultural relativism has freed us from blind conformity, but has also deprived us of the cultural certainty that previously provided automatic life direction. Perhaps the most fundamental of all the fictions that is collapsing is that of the separation between human and machine, between natural and artificial. This distinction organized our entire understanding of ourselves and our place in the world during the industrial era. Humans were conscious and creative agents. Machines were passive and mechanical tools. Nature was a separate realm that we could study, control, and exploit. But the biotechnological and artificial intelligence revolution is obliterating these boundaries in ways that our language and concepts still cannot adequately process. Today, AI algorithms exhibit behaviors that we can only describe as creativity, intuition, and even personality. Genetic engineering is rewriting the code of life in ways that make it impossible to distinguish between what is natural and what is artificial. Brain-computer interfaces are beginning to connect our minds directly to digital systems. Virtual reality is creating experiences that can be more meaningful and emotionally impactful than physical reality. We are rapidly approaching a future where the distinction between human and artificial, between natural and technological, between real and simulated, simply no longer makes sense. This is not just a technological change, it is a fundamental ontological transformation in the nature of existence itself. What makes this situation particularly disorienting is that our brain evolved to detect immediate physical threats and sudden changes in environment, not to process gradual transformations in abstract conceptual structures. We can easily see when a building is on fire, but we cannot perceive when the entire conceptual foundation of our civilization is being slowly eroded. It is as if we were equipped with emergency detection systems designed for the African savanna, but we were trying to use these systems to navigate a world of exponential changes in virtual reality. Our growing anxiety and uneasiness are not signs that there is something wrong with us individually, but rather evidence that our perceptual systems are correctly detecting that something fundamental has changed in our environment, even if we cannot consciously articulate what it is. This situation creates a phenomenon we can call civilizational dissociation, just as a person can experience psychological dissociation when facing trauma that exceeds their processing capacity. Our entire civilization is experiencing a collective form of dissociation in the face of changes that exceed our cultural capacity for integration. Different groups of people are reacting to this dissociation in distinct but all problematic ways. Some are taking refuge in nostalgia, desperately trying to recreate idealized versions of past eras that never existed as they imagine. Others are embracing technological accelerationism, betting that if we advance fast enough through the transformation, we will arrive at some kind of post-human utopia on the other side. Still others are surrendering to nihilism, concluding that if nothing has stable meaning, then nothing really matters, and a large portion of the population is simply anesthetizing itself through entertainment, consumption, or substances, trying to completely avoid confronting these fundamental existential questions. I need to pause for a moment to ask, do you recognize this feeling I am describing? This sense that something fundamental has changed in the world, but you cannot put your finger on exactly what it is? That the rules of life's game have somehow changed, but nobody has explained to you what the new rules are? I know it can be disturbing to recognize that our uneasiness is not just personal, but a symptom of a larger civilizational transformation. If this description resonates with your experience, share in the comments. I feel the rules changed. When completing with a specific example from your life, your experience can help other people realize they are not alone in this sense of fundamental disorientation, and that naming what we are living through is the first step toward finding wiser ways to navigate through this transformation. But there is an even deeper dimension to this transformation that we need to examine. We are not just witnessing the collapse of specific fictions about individuality, truth, meaning, and humanity. We are witnessing the collapse of the very metacognitive structure that allows us to create stable fictions in the first place. Throughout all of human history, our ability to create shared narratives depended on three fundamental elements: enough time for new ideas to establish themselves and be tested through generations, trustworthy authorities capable of validating and transmitting knowledge, and relatively stable communities where people could develop deep relationships based on shared experiences. The digital revolution has destroyed all three elements simultaneously. The exponential acceleration of technological change means that new realities emerge faster than we can develop conceptual structures to understand them. We try to understand artificial intelligence using concepts developed for mechanical machines. We try to regulate biotechnology using legal frameworks developed for questions of physical property. We try to navigate social networks using intuitions about human relationships developed for small and stable groups. It is like trying to drive a Formula One car using techniques developed for riding a horse. The speed of change has exceeded our speed of conceptual adaptation, leaving us constantly trying to understand the present using categories from the past that no longer apply. Simultaneously, the democratization of authority through the internet has destroyed traditional mechanisms of knowledge validation. This has positive aspects. Previously marginalized voices can now be heard, and important information can no longer be suppressed by corrupt elites. But it has also created a fundamental epistemological crisis. When anyone can present themselves as an expert in any subject, and algorithms amplify voices based on emotional engagement rather than real expertise, we lose any reliable process for distinguishing between valid knowledge and irresponsible speculation. The result is not only confusion about specific facts, but a deeper erosion of the very idea that there can be such a thing as valid expertise. Finally, geographic mobility, economic instability, and digital mediation of relationships have destroyed the stable communities where we traditionally developed our understanding of the world through prolonged conversations and deep relationships. Today, most of our social interactions happen through digital platforms that encourage performance rather than authentic vulnerability, that amplify extreme positions rather than reflective nuance, and that fragment our attention rather than allowing the deep contemplation necessary for real wisdom. We have lost the social spaces where we traditionally collectively processed changes and developed new shared understandings about how to live. The result of this triple destruction is that we find ourselves in a situation unprecedented in human history. We are living through a radical civilizational transformation without possessing the cognitive and social structures necessary to process this transformation coherently. It is as if we were trying to perform brain surgery while the hospital is on fire and we have no adequate instruments. Our capacity to create collective meaning has been damaged exactly at the historical moment when we most need this capacity. This situation explains many of the apparently irrational phenomena we are observing around us. The growing popularity of conspiracy theories does not necessarily reflect a decline in collective intelligence, but rather a desperate attempt to create coherent narratives that explain the lived experience of radical transformation. When official explanations seem inadequate to capture the magnitude of what is happening, people naturally gravitate toward alternative explanations, even if these explanations are factually incorrect. Extreme political polarization is not just about ideological differences, but about different groups of people trying to preserve different pieces of the collective fictions that are collapsing. The epidemic of anxiety and depression, especially among young people, is not just about individual pressures, but about the difficulty of building stable identities and life purpose when all traditional categories are in constant flux. But here is the crucial question. Recognizing that we are living through the collapse of fundamental fictions does not mean we should conclude that these fictions were entirely false, or that we should live without fictions completely. The shared fictions about individuality, truth, meaning, and humanity were evolutionary tools that allowed us to create extraordinary civilizations, transcendent art, and deeply meaningful life experiences. The problem is not that we had fictions, but that our current fictions have become inadequate for the realities we have created. It is like using a 19th century city map to navigate a modern metropolis. The map was not a lie when it was created, but now it no longer corresponds to the territory. The challenge is not to eliminate fictions, but to develop new fictions more adequate to emerging realities. We need new narratives about what it means to be human in a world where the boundary between human and artificial is dissolving. We need new structures for creating and validating knowledge in a decentralized information environment. We need new sources of meaning and purpose that are resilient to contemporary speeds of change. And we need new models of community and relationship that work in a digitally mediated world. This is not a task we can accomplish individually. The fictions that structure social life only work when they are widely shared and can only emerge through collective processes of experimentation, dialogue, and refinement that take generations to mature. But we can begin this process by consciously recognizing our situation and committing ourselves to the difficult work of building new forms of understanding that are adequate to the world we are creating. This requires a fundamental shift in our relationship with uncertainty and change. Instead of trying to preserve conceptual categories from the past that no longer work, or taking refuge in nostalgia for eras that will never return, we need to learn to navigate consciously in a world where the only constant is transformation. This means developing what we can call adaptive wisdom, the ability to maintain our fundamental values while remaining flexible about the specific structures through which we express those values. It means learning to find meaning not in the stability of our circumstances, but in the quality of our response to constantly changing circumstances. It means developing relationships based not on fixed social roles, but on authentic presence and mutual curiosity about who we are becoming. More fundamentally, this requires that we recognize we are consciously participating in the evolution of human consciousness itself. We are not just passive victims of historical forces beyond our control. We are active participants in creating the realities that are emerging. Every choice we make about how to use technology, how we relate to one another, what kind of information we consume and propagate, what values we prioritize, is contributing to the form this transformation will take. This is an extraordinary responsibility, but also an unprecedented opportunity. Perhaps the most important aspect of this transformation is that it is forcing us to confront questions that humanity has avoided for millennia. What do we really want? Which values are truly fundamental to human flourishing? How can we create societies that maximize both individual freedom and collective cooperation? How can we develop technology that serves human purposes instead of enslaving us? These questions have always been implicit in the human condition, but the stable structures of traditional life allowed us to avoid them most of the time. Now, these questions have become urgent and unavoidable. The disorientation and anxiety that many of us are feeling are not signs that something is wrong with us. They are signs that we are alive and conscious during an extraordinary historical moment when all fundamental questions about human existence are being remade simultaneously. This is an honor and responsibility that most human beings throughout history never had. Most people lived and died within social and conceptual structures that were established long before their birth and that remained largely unchanged during their lifetimes. We have the terrifying privilege of consciously participating in the creation of new forms of being human. This recognition can free us from the feeling of victimization and powerlessness that often accompanies the perception that the world is falling apart. Yes, familiar structures are dissolving. Yes, this creates uncertainty and discomfort, but it also creates possibilities. We are living during one of the few epochs in human history when fundamental change is truly possible, when we are not trapped by the limitations of previous generations, when we can imagine and experiment with radically new ways of organizing human life. If these reflections have resonated with your own intuitions about the extraordinary historical moment we are living through, I invite you to join this ongoing conversation. By subscribing to the channel, you will connect with a growing community of people who are committed not only to understanding these transformations, but to consciously participating in creating wiser responses to them. We do not offer comfortable certainties or simple solutions, but a space to explore together the most important questions of our era. This is work for generations, and each unique perspective contributes to our collective understanding. Together, we can navigate through this transformation not as passive victims, but as conscious participants in the evolution of humanity itself. Subscribe to continue this essential journey, because understanding what is collapsing is the first step toward consciously building what comes next.
A lot of time when you ask artists or creators, what is the result? What are we trying to achieve? One very common answer is that they are trying to create a certain state of mind in somebody else, to bring up a certain emotion, joy or sadness or whatever. And this is the kind of thing that potentially AI would be very good at. Even if it has no emotions of its own, it will be able to recognize the emotion of other people and then find by trial and error how, if you imagine, like if you compare a human being, like our emotional system is basically like a piano, that the AI will learn how to produce sadness, how to produce joy, how to produce fear or awe better than a human artist, simply through the sheer volume of information it can process.
There's already lots of people who are spending hours and hours and hours a day talking to and interacting with their AI best friends, their AI lovers, etc. That's only going to get way more sophisticated.
Absolutely.
And I think those folks, and I'm not excluding myself, who knows? I mean, I don't mean to other them. I think it's going to be very, very common. We're all going to get really emotionally attached to these AI characters that we interact with. And I think it's going to feel very natural to start talking about AI rights, comparing it to civil rights. And I'm quite concerned that if we go down that road, it could be very perilous, that that affordance of those rights could go hand in hand with some of the worst dystopian outcomes that you describe in your book.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I think one of the major things about AIs that we will see is that it will be able to create intimate relationships with human beings.
Yes.
I don't necessarily mean sexual, could be also sexual, but intimate.
Oh, it'll be
relationships-
sexual. That's what, not all it'll be, but
Yeah, some. And it's very close. It's already beginning to happen. It will be a major issue in societies all over the world.
Writing history is somewhere in between kind of science and art. To write a history book, it's not an equation. You need to tell stories. So I also, to some extent, I see myself as an artist. And I don't know if I'll still be writing books in 5 years or 10 years, because maybe by the 2030s, AIs will write books like Sapiens and Nexus so much better than me that it will be kind of almost meaningless for a human being to engage in that. The amount of information that I can gather is infinitesimal compared to the AI. Yeah. I've already seen, these wonderful stories written by AI, and I agree that humans will always want to create for the joy of creating, as children do. But would it still be valued? Until today, it's not just that we liked doing it, it was extremely valuable. Nothing on planet Earth could be as creative as us. And now in more and more fields, there is something.